disappointed with some of the statements that President-elect Trump has made. For example, saying that, quote, we won't give him, referring to Governor Newsom, money to put out all his fires. And if we don't give him money to put out fires, he's got a problem. The specter is there of potential discrimination based on politics, withholding money from California or other states. It's not an unfounded fear. In the last administration, there were public reports about President Trump withholding money from the state of Washington because of his disagreements with Governor Inslee. Connecticut, like the rest of the nation, suffers from these now. Thanks, Senator Johnson. Welcome, Governor Noem, and thank you for being here. Thank you for visiting with me, and thank you to your family for their service as well. Let me begin on a high note, thanking Senator Hawley for his leadership on the effort that I led with him to essentially get some basic facts out of the Secret Service when we were investigating, Senator Johnson and I, as leaders of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigation, helping to lead it with the chairman and ranking member here. And I'm hoping that you've read our report and that you will agree to begin implementing its recommendations, which call for major reforms, in my view, a house cleaning top to bottom in the Secret Service, and greater transparency with this committee and with the American public.
Yes, sir. I will certainly work with you to do that and to work to make sure that we have that transparency and the committee has the information that it needs to do due diligence of its oversight.
Our investigation is continuing. Yep. Senator Johnson and I have discussed it, and we will be making more requests to pursue the fact-finding that is so important. I want to ask you about disaster relief. California is on fire. The fires raging there are going to leave destruction and devastation that is heartbreaking. I am really disappointed with some of the statements that President-elect Trump has made. For example, saying that, quote, we won't give him, referring to Governor Newsom, money to put out all his fires. And if we don't give him money to put out fires, he's got a problem. The specter is there of potential discrimination based on politics, withholding money from California or other states. It's not an unfounded fear. In the last administration, there were public reports about President Trump withholding money from the state of Washington because of his disagreements with Governor Inslee. Connecticut, like the rest of the nation, suffers from these natural disasters. Most recently, in August, we were hit by major flooding, and these natural disasters are going to become more frequent, as will be the need for the federal government to meet the requests for declarations of natural disaster. I assume you will agree with me that withholding disaster relief by President Trump or any other chief executive of the United States is a violation of his duty and of law.
Well, Senator, leadership has consequences, and looking at the tragedy that's happening in California,
I want to ask you yes or no, with all due respect. It's an easy.
What's happening in California is the ramification of many decisions over many years. But under my leadership at the Department of Homeland Security, there will be no political bias to how disaster relief is delivered to the American people.
So if President Trump were to say to you, we're going to withhold money from Connecticut or Michigan or any of the states, Iowa, because we don't like the governor or we don't like the politics of the state, you would stand up to him and say, Mr. President, we need to allocate that money.
Well, Senator, in 3 days, President Trump will take an oath to uphold the Constitution and the rule of law in this country, and he will do that, and I'll be glad to have him back.
And I don't speak
to hypotheticals, which is what you're asking me to do, but what I will tell you is that as Secretary, I will do the same. I will deliver the programs as the
Well, it's
laws
more than a
dictate.
hypothetical, with all due respect, and I apologize for interrupting you, but my time is limited, as you know, as a veteran of these hearings. It's more than a hypothetical. It's based on experience with President Trump withholding money from Washington State and elsewhere. I need to know from you, will you stand up to the president and say, no, the Constitution and the Impoundment Act requires us, for example, to allocate the $100 billion that we have just appropriated in the last session to states like Connecticut, $3 million, Texas, $10 million, almost every one of the states represented here. Will you say no to the president if he withholds that money?
Sir, I don't know about the scenarios that you're referencing with President Trump, but what I will tell you is that if given the chance to be Secretary of Homeland Security, that I will deliver the programs according to the law and that it will be done with no political bias. And if the programs change, or if you decide to change the rule of law, then I will follow that while
So you
adhering to the
pledge to
Constitution.
allocate and distribute that $100 billion.
According to how the program is written, with no political bias. Every American deserves to be there and have disaster relief the same as their neighbors.
Basically following the law.
Yes.
Let me ask you, Senator Peters asked you about homegrown terrorists. The New Orleans tragedy was the result of a homegrown terrorist born in this country, radicalized by ISIS. And it reflects the reason why the intelligence community, the FBI, almost all of our law enforcement has said repeatedly, domestic violent extremism is the most lethal and persistent threat to our security. That terrorist was radicalized by ISIS. The investigation is underway. We don't know all the facts, but we do know that he was a military veteran and ISIS was responsible for radicalizing him. Shouldn't we focus on ISIS as a threat to this country's security?
Senator, certainly we should be focused on all threats to this nation's security. That's the mission of the Department of Homeland Security, and homegrown terrorism is growing. We have more and more incidences. The tragedy we saw and the terrorist attack
What
in
will
New
you
Orleans
do to combat it? What will you do to stop ISIS and other extremist organizations from radicalizing people in this country?
Well, certainly, Senator, I'll continue to work with the administration and our partners and the Department of Defense, the intelligence agencies, also within Secretary of State and the other branches and cabinet officials to make sure we're bringing all resources to bear to identify and to stop these types of terrorist activities. What I would say is the cybersecurity and intelligence elements that we have within the Department of Homeland Security have been incredibly siloed. They have not communicated with other intelligence agencies like they should and partnered. INA has some interaction, but not enough. And we also need to have CISA have interaction with the FBI, CIA to make sure they're working together to stop these types of threats and identify when they're growing among our citizens and how they become radicalized.
This area of questioning, I think, is supremely important. I know there's a lot of focus on the border. We all want more border security. We want to stop migrant crime, but let's not take our eye off the ball. The governor of Louisiana for the Super Bowl ought to be really riveted on the potential for homegrown terrorism as a threat. And I hope that you will help him and other governors to do their duty to protect the people of the United States from that homegrown terrorist.
It ends with a tension you can feel even through the grain of the microphone. Senator Richard Blumenthal pressing forward, each question sharper than the last, and Governor Kristi Noem holding her ground with practiced steadiness. What begins as a conversation about disaster relief becomes something far larger, a clash over presidential power, constitutional duty, and the basic promise that federal aid, the lifeline for Americans in crisis, must never be rationed by political favor. The moment that sets everything off is a single pointed question. Withholding disaster relief by President Trump or any other chief executive, is that a violation of his duty and of law? A yes or no, clean, simple, direct. But Noem does not answer simply. She begins to contextualize, speaking about leadership, long-term policy failures in California, decades of forest management decisions. Blumenthal cuts in, the frustration rising, and demands again. Would you stand up to him? Would you say no if he tried to withhold money from Connecticut, from Michigan, from any state because he doesn't like the governor or the politics? This exchange isn't hypothetical to him. He cites public reports from the last administration, the federal government considering withholding wildfire assistance from Washington state because of disagreements with Governor Jay Inslee. For Blumenthal, this is not theory, it is precedent, and he wants an answer on the record. Noem stays on message. She will follow the law. There will be no political bias. She will administer programs as written, but she repeatedly avoids saying the words Blumenthal is chasing, that she would confront a sitting president directly and refuse an unlawful order. To some viewers, that looks like caution, a nominee refusing to be baited into hypotheticals. To others, it looks like hesitation, a reluctance to say plainly that federal disaster aid cannot be weaponized. That tension is the heart of the moment, because what Blumenthal is really asking is something deeper. When the law is tested not in theory, but in practice, when the pressure comes from the Oval Office itself, who will stand between power and abuse? Who will protect the vulnerable when disaster strikes? As the fires in California burn, as towns drown in floods, as hurricanes tear at coastlines, Americans do not care about political party. They care about survival. They care about whether the country will show up for them at their lowest moment. They care about whether FEMA trucks will roll into their community without anyone first checking how their governor voted. These are questions of morality, cloaked in the dry language of appropriations. And on this day, in this hearing room, those questions break into the open. But the hearing does not stay with disaster relief alone. It shifts, abruptly, urgently, to homegrown terrorism in the aftermath of a devastating attack in New Orleans. Blumenthal moves from natural disasters to ideological ones, from firestorms to radicalization. He points out what law enforcement agencies have said for years, that domestic violent extremism is the most lethal and persistent threat to the United States. A veteran, a citizen, radicalized by ISIS, a tragedy that unfolded not at a border, not overseas, but from within. And he presses Noem again. What will you do to stop this? How will you defend against extremists who operate online, in private chat rooms, in our own backyards? Will you strengthen coordination among DHS, the intelligence community, the Department of Defense, and the FBI? Will you break down the silos that have allowed threats to fester unseen? Here, Noem gives a clearer answer. She speaks about cyber intelligence, about expanding coordination, about fixing the fractured channels of communication that have long plagued DHS. She lays out a future in which federal agencies actually speak to one another, a vision that feels almost radical in its simplicity. Yet beneath the surface lies the thread connecting both sets of questions: trust. Trust in the government to deploy aid without bias. Trust in the intelligence system to catch threats before they explode. Trust in the people nominated to lead, to defend the Constitution not just when convenient, but when demanded. In this hearing, that trust is being tested in real time. Blumenthal wants more than assurances. He wants commitment. Noem offers loyalty to the law, not confrontation with the president. And between those two positions lies the unresolved tension that defines this political moment. This is what these hearings lay bare. The American system is strongest not when leaders promise loyalty upward, but when they stand firm on the guardrails that protect ordinary people. Disaster victims, citizens targeted by extremists, families who don't know, and shouldn't have to know, the inner workings of federal politics. They only know that when the sky turns orange or when terror strikes at home, they need help, they need protection, and they need leaders willing to say no when no is the only answer the Constitution allows. As the cameras fade and senators shuffle out to their next votes, the weight of these questions remains. They linger in the silence of the wood-paneled room. They follow Governor Noem as she steps away from the witness table. They follow every American watching, wondering whether the next disaster, whether natural or man-made, will be met with fairness, with integrity, with courage. These hearings matter because they reveal what cannot be hidden behind press releases or speeches. The spine of our public servants, the pressure points of our democracy, and the places where the law must hold firm even when politics rages around it. If you believe these exchanges should be seen in full, without filters, so the public can judge for itself, if you believe accountability does not begin at the press conference, but in the hard questions asked in rooms like this, if you believe the country deserves to see how power answers back, then stay with us. Subscribe to Congress Signal. Support our work to bring these moments to light, the confrontations, the tension, the truth, so that every American can witness the choices being made in their name.